All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's great to be back. Yeah, it's a kind of unusual situation. I was asked to write this paper for a book, and I'm thinking, oh, this is great, an invitation. And then it's like, the book is on reflection. Well, I have nothing to say about reflection. That's not so great. But luckily, I have a few things to say about Sosa, and Sosa has some things to say about reflection. So I thought, this is my point of entry. So this is what you're gonna get. We can all skip the Q&A because any questions that you may have will be answered in the written version of this paper anyway. So yeah, this is a kind of peculiar situation. So, it's the first time I'm giving this paper, and it's the first time that I'm giving a paper as a presentation after it has appeared in print. So well, let's see how this goes. So this is on the status of reflection in virtue epistemology, and the title is much more grandiose than the paper, which is really a paper about Sosa. So you would have to go in for a sort of fairly ambitious identification of Sosa and virtue epistemology, to which I know a couple of people in this room, including myself, would otherwise object. Okay, so let's start with a distinction that's very familiar from the literature. Internalism, externalism. Here is a way of thinking about the classical versions of these two views. So classical internalism being the view that knowledge requires justification, and that justification is sort of unpacked, at least in part, in terms of what you're able to access by reflection alone. Okay, so one interesting thing about classical internalism, thus construed, is that reflection is absolutely central to epistemology, right? It's sort of at the normative core of the central normative condition on knowledge, justification, right? Justification requires reflection, knowledge requires justification. Justification is the central normative property of knowledge, so it's really at the very heart of epistemology, according to classical internalism. Okay, classical externalism, here presented as process reliabilism, you can easily see that reflection is not equally central, right? What matters is whether your beliefs are produced by reliable processes, and these processes need not at all involve perception. Okay, so there has been a move away from the classical internalist picture, and I think what has driven many of us away from embracing the classical internalism is this kind of over-intellectualization thought, right? So very roughly the thought is, well, there are these sort of agents who are cognitively unsophisticated, animals, small children, right? And they are cognitively unsophisticated in that they might not even have sort of any reflective equipment, cognitive equipment, right? But they can still have knowledge, maybe simple perceptual knowledge, something like that, right? But of course, agents who don't have the reflective equipment, they can't access anything by reflection alone, and so knowledge can't require access by reflection. Right? And I think there's kind of quite a few people who take this line very, very seriously. And the trend, I think, there's been a trend that reflection has been kind of dethroned. Right? So it's no longer thought to occupy this absolutely central status in epistemology. There's been a move towards externalism, and among the internalists there's been a move towards mentalism, I guess, as a result of this, right? Now, one thing that's really interesting about Sosa is that he is, I mean, a sort of really thoroughgoing externalist, right? So like, you know, one of the most famous reliabilists on the market, but at the same time, and I'll show you how this works momentarily, he thinks, on his view, reflection is really central to epistemology. In fact, it's central to performance normativity. We'll see what that is. In general, of which epistemology, epistemic normativity of belief is but an instance, right? So Sosa seems to offer us a rehabilitation of reflection in epistemology from an externalist point of view, and that's kind of an interesting space to occupy, right? So that's why I thought, well, that's an in for me. I can start engaging with this kind of literature. Okay, so that's the setup. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to outline Sosa's view briefly, and then I'm going to argue that Sosa does face the over-intellectualization worry, and then I'm going to try and embark on some sort of a rescue mission, kind of trying to see how we can think of Sosa's view in such a way that the over-intellectualization worry can be escaped. And then I'm going to, at the end, return to the question of what does that mean for reflection? Do we have a rehabilitation of reflection, or maybe not? Okay, so let's start with what Ernie has to say. So Ernie and, you know, a sort of set of people interested in virtue epistemology who are sort of falling into the reliabilist camp. They like to start thinking about epistemology by thinking about performance normativity, as it's known, right? And so the thought here is, if we have a performance with an aim, right, like taking a shot in archery that aims at hitting the target, then there are three dimensions along which we can assess this performance. So we can ask, is it successful? Does the performance attain its aim? We can ask, was the performance competent? Was it produced by an ability to attain the relevant success? And then there is the question of aptness. Was the performance successful because competent, right? So as I'm taking my archery shot, you can ask yourself, well, did this shot hit the target? Was it produced by an ability to hit the target? And did it hit the target because it was so produced? Right? And you can see, maybe worth pointing out briefly, aptness requires success and competence, but aptness is more than just success and competence. The two have to be related in the right way. Right? So the thought is, if you take a perfectly competent shot that's blown off its trajectory to the target by a gust of wind, but then you have the helper with the wind machine who sort of brings it back on, you have competence, you have success, but you don't have aptness, because why did the shot hit the target? Well, we wouldn't say, well, because it was competent, but because there were these sort of two things happening that made the shot hit the target anyway. Okay, so that's the simple framework, and then Ernie wants to complicate this even further by distinguishing three types of aptness. So we have aptness on the animal level, which is just sort of simple first order apt performance, and then we have two further types of aptness that involve reflection of some sort. So there's reflective aptness and full aptness, right? So reflective aptness is apt performance conjoined with an apt awareness that one's performance would be apt, right? So as I'm taking the shot, for my shot to be reflectively apt, it's got to hit the target because of my archery competence, but it's also going to be the case that I'm aware that my shot would hit the target. Okay, and then there's full aptness that again has connects these two components of reflective aptness. So they need to be connected in the right way. They have to be the apt performance needs to be guided to aptness by the awareness. So the contrast case is one where I take a shot and it's apt, and I'm aware that it would be apt, but before taking the shot I flip a coin If it comes up heads, then I'm taking the shot. If it comes up tails, I'll just do nothing. And the thought is there, I have aptness and this apt awareness of, counterfactual aptness, but they are not related in any way. And in the normal way, right, where you sort of see that the shot would go, and in light of that, you take the shot and succeed. That's the then you attain full aptness. Okay, so Ernie really thinks that full aptness is what it's all about, and that has special status as it were. So here are a couple of quotes from the 2015 book. The fully desirable status for performances in general is full aptness. It is aptness on the first order, guided by apt awareness on the second order, that the first order performance would be apt, likely enough. Okay. Another quote. Even while succeeding in its basic aim, a performance falls short if it neglects attaining that aim aptly. This latter is an aim also required for full credit in the domain of that performance. What is yet more, full credit requires that this aim too be attained aptly. That is so for all first order performances, in whatever domain, whether cognitive or not. Okay, so the take-home lesson that I want to sort of see in these quotes is that Ernie basically signs up to this thing that I call the normative thesis. Any performance in any domain attains fully desirable status qua performance in that domain, if and only if it's fully apt, and falls short qua performance in that domain, if and only if it isn't. I think that's basically a summary of those quotations. And so what are the motivations for signing up to this? Typically Ernie gives us some cases that motivate this, right? So here's one involving basketball. So you're taking a shot and you're close to the end of your range, right? So you're reliable within a certain range, and you're close to the point where you're no longer reliable. Right? And now there are two cases. In the first case, you are aware that while you're close to the end of your range, you're within that range, and you take a shot guided by this awareness. And then in the second case, you are unaware of this, right? And Ernie's thought is, well, there's an important intuitive difference between these two cases. Only the first case is one where you attain fully desirable status, and in the second case, in some way you fall short. And the normative thesis allows us to explain these intuitions quite nicely. In both cases you attain aptness, but only in the first case will you attain full aptness. Right? Second case is aptness without full aptness, or even reflective aptness. Okay, so that's the normative thesis and its motivation. Here is a psychological thesis that Ernie signs up to, which is that belief is a type of performance with an aim. More specifically, it's a distinctively epistemic type of performance, and its aim is truth. Right? So this is something that many virtue epistemologists who like this kind of performance normativity approach will sign up to, or a version of which they will sign up to. There are some people who think this is, fundamentally misguided. That's not a discussion I want to get into here. I'll just take this on board, right? What I'm interested in are some of the consequences, right? Basically, if we combine the normative and the psychological thesis, one result that we get is that a belief attains fully desirable status qua epistemic performance, if and only if it's fully apt. And it falls short if it isn't. Okay? So then the last thesis that Ernie signs up to is an epistemological thesis, and that is that human knowledge is fully apt belief. So we have that identification, right? Now, and you can see how this is neat, right? So you get a kind of nice explanation of the value of knowledge over beliefs that fall short of knowledge, right? Or the value of human knowledge, right? Because given the epistemological thesis and the one that we saw earlier, fully desirable belief, right? We get the result that a belief attains fully desirable status only if it qualifies as human knowledge, right? So if you fall short of human knowledge, you're falling short of fully desirable belief. So you have a sort of story as to why it's better to have human knowledge than not. And another interesting consequence is that here we have the rehabilitation of reflection in epistemology, right? So fully desirable belief or human knowledge, that requires awareness, right? Apt awareness that one's belief would be apt. And there we go, where this enters in a way through the central normative property again, right? The central normative property to knowledge is full aptness, and full aptness is a thing that essentially requires awareness, right? That's how it's defined. And so again, reflection is at the very normative core of epistemology. Okay, so the trouble is on the horizon. In particular, I think you can run a kind of over-intellectualization worry against the normative thesis, right? That Ernie endorses, right? So you know, you might say, so this is just sort of as a reminder, the normative thesis, fully desirable status for a performance requires full aptness, and otherwise it falls short. And so fully desirable status requires reflection, right? And you might say, well, that seems very strong, right? So you know, it looks as though the performances of unsophisticated agents, they can attain fully desirable status without full aptness, right? So the waggle dance of the honeybee or something like that doesn't fall short qua waggle dance in virtue of the fact that bees don't have reflective capacities, right? That would be crazy. But if that's right, then it looks as though the normative thesis falls prey to an over-intellectualization worry. Okay, and that's in a way bad news for Ernie, because the normative thesis in conjunction with this psychological thesis motivates this idea that the fully desirable status of belief is full aptness, and that in turn contributes significantly to the motivation of the key epistemological thesis, which identifies human knowledge with fully apt belief, right? Because in this way you can reap the benefits of having this nice account of the value of knowledge and so on. And if you can't have the normative thesis, then by the same token you lose a key motivation for the epistemological thesis, right? So you might say, well, you know, if the normative thesis is incorrect, and the fully desirable status of belief is not fully apt belief, but something else, right? Why should we identify human knowledge with fully apt belief rather than with whatever else is required for fully desirable status? So that doesn't look too good. And now you might say, well, maybe there's a kind of way to rescue Ernie. You might say, well, maybe you can restrict the normative thesis to kinds of performances that only sophisticated agents are in a position to perform, right? So you say this only applies to those kinds of agents. And then there is this kind of move that Ernie makes in judgment and agency, which is to identify knowledge with a species of judgment or judgmental beliefs. And judgment is a type of is a psychological category that aims at alethic aptness, right? So basically, it has reflection written into its very aim, right? So if you don't have the equipment, reflective equipment, then you're not in a position to aim at to aim at alethic aptness, and so you're not in a position to make judgments, right? And so in this way you might say, okay, so if we want to restrict the normative thesis in this way, then we can avoid the over-intellectualization worry, because it sort of just doesn't apply anymore. But we can, retain the intended epistemological application of that thesis, because judgment is still governed by that thesis. Okay, so is that going to work? And my answer is no, right? Because even if the restricted thesis holds, right, then the result that we get is that a judgment attains fully desirable status if and only if it is fully apt, right? Now, what Ernie says about apt judgment is that it requires one to affirm aptly in the endeavor to alethically affirm aptly. But if that's what's required for apt judgment, then fully apt judgment will require us, in addition, at the very least, to arrive at an apt awareness then that one would indeed affirm aptly in the endeavor to alethically affirm aptly, and for one's apt affirmation in the endeavor to affirm aptly to be guided by this apt awareness. Right? I mean, so that is something that I can barely read without stuttering, as you just witnessed. And my hunch is that very few of us ever sort of rise to such intellectual heights. So my diagnosis is, if fully apt judgment requires that, then it's at best extremely rare among humans. Okay? So if this restricted version of the normative thesis holds, then judgment that attains fully desirable status is at best extremely rare among humans. So if the restricted thesis holds, then either nearly all of human knowledge falls short qua epistemic performance, which I would think is a bad result, or there is very, very little of it, which is potentially the only thing that would be worse. So basically the thought is, if you endorse the normative thesis and you sort of want to say, well, knowledge is a type of judgment, or the restricted normative thesis with that, then you're committed to bad results anyway, so that's not going to rescue the view for you. What does rescue the view? So here's my proposal. Call this the simple normative thesis. The fully desirable status for performances in general is simple first order aptness. Okay, so there's some benefits, right? It avoids the over-intellectualization worry, right? Because first order aptness is attainable by unsophisticated agents. We don't even have to sort of bracket them or something like that, right? We can just say, yeah, the waggle dance of the honeybee, that can be apt when it's sort of successful because competent, right? And that may or may not happen. And it's compatible with a plausible version of Ernie's claim that knowledge is a species of judgment, namely apt judgment without the bad consequences. So the thought being that apt judgment, I'm granting Ernie that that's something that we can frequently attain, but we're not sort of making this kind of hugely, the commitments to like hugely complicated intellectual achievements that comes with fully apt judgment, right, which I don't think many of us ever attain. Okay, so here's the problem for this kind of view. What do we say about the motivations for the normative thesis, right? The basketball case, where we want to say, well, in the first case, right, something goes wrong. In the first case, everything goes right, but in the second case, something goes wrong. So Ernie had a nice diagnosis of this, right? The first case is one of full aptness, and the second case isn't, even though both are cases of aptness. And so what can we say about these cases? And I want to say, well, there is a way to deal with this, and that involves recognizing that there are different types of performances that we may be engaging in at the same time, right? And they might be nested in each other, right? So in the basketball case, we have a performance of the type shot, right, which is sort of, instantiated by this movement. But there's also a type of performance that we might call a play, right, that involves the implementation of a choice of one or more specific ways of playing, right? So as I'm here on the court, I need to choose. Do I pass the ball? Do I continue dribbling? Do I take a shot? And so on, right? And so I choose one of those options, right? But given that these are different types of performances, we get the result that there are two different types of fully desirable status that we can, ask whether they're attained. One concerns the shot, and the other concerns the play. Now, on my view, the one that I'm proposing, the simple view, as it were, the question is, in both cases that's relevant here is, was the performance apt? Was the shot apt? Does it go in due to my ability to shoot basketballs? And for the play, you might say, well, that's a more complicated thing, right? Of course, the shot must be apt because that's sort of a nested performance of the performance type play. But there's also a choice involved, and the choice leading to that performance. So you might say, well, the selection must be apt, and the apt selection must lead the way to the aptness of the nested shot. So you can see that is sort of very reminiscent of what Ernie calls full aptness, right? But the thought is we can accommodate the importance of full aptness just by distinguishing different types of performances and allowing them to be simple first order apt. Right? So the result that we get is that in both of these basketball cases, the shot is apt, right? But in only one of them, namely the first one, the play is apt as well, right? And the second one, you have no good awareness of what you should do because you're so deprived. So you end up with an inapt play. Okay, so that's my suggestion for rescuing Ernie's view from over-intellectualization. And then there is the question, where does that leave reflection, right? So we saw Ernie can plausibly lay claim to rehabilitating reflection in epistemology, right? And you might say, okay, so there's some good news, right? Human knowledge is apt judgment. We keep that part of Ernie's view, right, where we understand this apt judgment as a kind of type of performance at the level of play, so to speak, that involves making a choice to form a belief or to suspend or something like that, right, and leading the way towards the relevant belief or not. But apt judgment essentially involves reflection, so reflection is essential to human knowledge. Okay, so you might say, okay, that looks good. However, I'm ultimately somewhat less optimistic about this new view, because remember, on Ernie's original view, right, if you want to say the normative core of knowledge is full aptness, right, and of performances more general, right, and full aptness requires reflection. So reflection comes in at the very core of knowledge, at the very core of the normativity, right, that we're interested in knowledge. And likewise, you might say, well, unreflective knowledge is somehow relegated to second-rate status, right? It's not like, it always falls short qua epistemic performance, because to not fall short, you've got to be fully apt, and that would require reflection. And that seems like a really, robust form of rehabilitating reflection in epistemology. Now, on the new view, the normative core of knowledge is just plain first-order aptness, and that does not require reflection, right? So reflection is not really at the normative core of knowledge, right? Rather, the way it enters is through psychology, right? So knowledge involves this specific, or human knowledge involves a specific psychological category, which is a judgment, and that judgment is a type of thing that involves reflection, right? But there is a big difference here between, like, Ernie's view and classical internalism, right? Where also the reflection entered in the normative core of knowledge, right? In justification, and for Ernie it was in full aptness, right? And now that's lost. And likewise, unreflective knowledge is not relegated to second-rate status, right? It's just, it attains fully desirable status, just like human knowledge, right? It's just that it's sort of realized in a different psychological category, so to speak. So ultimately, I'm sort of not so sure that it'll work as a rehabilitation of reflection in epistemology once we sort of, tweak it in such a way that we can avoid the over-intellectualization worry. It's sort of still more central than for many other views, but is it a kind of fully successful rehabilitation? I'm not so sure. And with that, I'm at the end. Thanks.